Thank you very much.
The microphone?
Yep, thank you, Alan. Is that better? Is that the way it works? All right. So, in this paper I want to navigate the Joris-Bede connection by journeying in the opposite direction from the one discussed by Peter. Instead of concentrating on the beats as poetic enablers for Joris, I wish to focus on Joris as an enabler of Bede scholarship. More specifically, I will reflect on how Joris's own work and its core drive towards nomadism, understood as both travel and travail, may deepen and modify our understanding of the Bede's experimental writing practices and experimental religiosity. The impetus for that reflection is the still heavily divided assessment of Bede Buddhism and its contribution to the development of Western Buddhism in general, as well as the equally divided assessment of Kerouac's engagement with Buddhist texts in translation. As someone working in a department where linguistics and literature are mingled in the same curriculum, and in a professional environment with a strong philological tradition tending to deride any form of adaptation other than pure translation, I remain obsessed with the gap in assessments of Kerouac's Buddhist-inspired texts, whether these remain rather conventional in form or belong to the more playful, unorthodox kind. I remain all the more obsessed with this problem of pure versus impure translation as a reader who, like Kerouac and Pierre Joris, is not trapped in what Joris refers to as the mental prison house of monolingualism, but who herself, like Kerouac, can only access the Buddhist classics in translation by others. So what I share with Kerouac is the problem of derived exposure and understanding through derived translation. Indeed, what are we to make of the huge gulfs that, for instance, separate an early and late assessment of Kerouac, yet an assessment made by two men familiar with the philological intricacies of translation from Asian languages, namely the poet Kenneth Rexroth and the Buddhologist Robert Thurman. One only needs to put their contradictory opinions side by side to become aware of how open the problem of expert and analytical versus emotional and poetic translation remains. On the one hand, back in the 50s, in the heyday of the so-called San Francisco Renaissance of American poetry, a translator of Chinese and Japanese verse like Rexroth could write that Kerouac was the most excited Buddhist I have ever heard of, whilst also condemning him for his lapses into pages of terrifying gibberish and publicly deriding him for his over-enthusiasm and naivete in believing himself to have been one of the first Americans to have read the Lotus Sutra and other classics. And those anecdotes are actually a compound from what Tom Clark, one of the biographers of Kerouac, refers to, and also Gerald Nicosia, who's not here, but I acknowledge my sources, contrary to the Sampras family. Anyway, so conversely, today Robert Thurman, a one-time chair of religious studies at Columbia University and a foremost expert on Tibetan Buddhism, confidently sees Kerouac as, I quote, lead bodhisattva way back there in the 1950s among all of our American predecessors. A lead bodhisattva whose popularizing of the Buddha Dharma in American idiom deserves to be taken seriously by specialists like him. Thurman ventures the hypothesis that it was because Kerouac was more moved by the Indian Mahayana line than by the Zen Buddhist one that early California Buddhists like Gary Snyder and Alan Watts had, like Rexroth and others, a problem fully understanding Kerouac's approach. But in his long introduction to Kerouac's Wake Up, A Life of the Buddha, one of Kerouac's didactic Buddhist works not released before 2008, at no point does Thurman use the issue of philology and impure approach in the translation as weapons against Kerouac, although Thurman would be most authorized to do so, and more authorized than most, actually, to do so. Well, the more I read Joris, the more I realize how helpful his concept of nomadic poetics and nomadic translation, concepts derived, fed on, expanded from Deleuze and Guattari, and linked by a rhizomatic practice in view of the imagination, prove in a renewed appreciation of Kerouac's Buddhist-inspired work, an appreciation neither blocked by the repeated charge of easy appropriation in a detraditionalized expression of an equally detraditionalized form of Buddhist spirituality, nor an appreciation hampered by the inevitable contradictions in Kerouac's utopian attempt to achieve a synthesis between Catholic theism and the non-theistic space of shunyata, emptiness, vacuity. Bent talked about that a little bit yesterday, and I've always also addressed, these contradictions in detail elsewhere in some articles of mine. So this is where I believe technology comes in. Yeah. Okay. So let me excerpt here a few of the pivotal statements that appear both in Joris's published and unpublished work. And again, I think they deserve to be read out in their entirety because some of the terms will resurface in the analysis. So Joris highlights that the essential quality of the rhizome, parallel to that aspect we learn from early collage, namely that one corner is as important as another corner, is that the rhizome has no beginning or end. It is always in the middle, between things, interbeing, intermezzo. He also states that what is needed now is a nomadic poetics. Its method will be rhizomatic, which is different from collage. This is to say, a rhizomatics is not an aesthetics of the fragment which has dominated poetics since the Romantics, even as transmogrified by modernism high and low, and more recently retooled in the neoclassical form of the citation, ironic or decorative, throughout what is called postmodernism. Strawberry fields forever. A nomadic poetics will cross languages, not just translate, but write in all or any of them. If Pound, H.D., Joyce, Stein, Olsen and others have shown the way, it is essential now to push this matter further again, not so much as collage, though we will keep those games, but as a material flux of language matter. And toward a nomadic concept of translation, an unpublished lecture given at the MLA conference in Toronto in 1997, and which Peter was kind enough to share with me back last year, Joris also offers the following pronouncements as to how translation itself can be conceived of in a more nomadic way. One, that questions the more mainstream, I quote, student translators' romantic aesthetic of transparency. So Joris highlights that it is exactly in such a questioning of this aesthetic of transparency that it becomes possible to question and even invert the traditional relationship of original text and translated copy and reinscribe the activity of translation as a core process of writing and thinking. And again, I think that in that pronouncement actually the ghost of Burroughs is also very, very much present. Joris also adds, we will interpret translation in the widest possible manner, to carry over, which is what to translate actually means, to carry over. This means that the range of translations we will deal with will reach beyond the purely interlingual translations. To put it in the broadest terms, all art is translation. Thus, in its attempt to move beyond the aesthetics of the collage and the fragment, Let me put those two quotes that I've just cited up there to accompany the rest. Thus, in its attempt to move beyond the aesthetics of the collage and the fragment, Joris's nomadic poetics strives for a textual structure in which, indeed, one corner is as important as another corner, the rhizome having no beginning or end, and being always in the middle, between things, interbeing, intermezzo. By extension, nomadic translation opens up the translator's space to intralingual as well as intermedia translation, and recognizes it as a reenactment of some given as proper original. Certain forms of translation imply as rhizomatic a process as those of writing and aesthetic creation themselves. In fact, the debate epitomized by Rexroth versus Thurman is not without recalling the one of Joris versus Eshelman in the essay Community of Translation and Translation of Community in Robin Blazer. In this piece, via Robin Blazer and Giorgio Agamben, Joris precisely extends the notion of nomadism to the practice of translation by challenging the strict binary divide between the philological and the poetic, the divide in terms of which Clayton Eshelman discusses some of Jack Spicer's impure and unorthodox translations of Federico Garcia Lorca. Unsurprisingly, being himself a rigorous practitioner of the craft of translating, Joris readily admits that when engaging in it, the conventional divide between translator and translator must be maintained. However, in nearly the same breath, Joris also points out to what extent a drive towards philological purity only constitutes a pull towards a frontier that cannot ever be conquered, and that is bound to deceive the translator in pursuing it. In the same essay, Joris further elaborates on the impossible ideal of the pure translation, wholly devoid of any trace of projection of the translator's part, by adding that both the original and its translation are an, I quote, undecidable mix of proper and improper. For Joris, a translation is in all likelihood the most improper possible being, because in its very being it is always derived, it always comes after something else, as a reenactment of some given as proper original. And those are Joris's words, reenactment of some given as proper original. However, subverting the reader's expectations vis-à-vis the professional translator he is, Joris breaks with the conventional view of the unattainability of pure translation in terms of tragic loss. Instead, as regards the new cracks in the bark of the text, inevitably opened up by the dirt dangling from the roots and branches of both language and translation, Joris invites us to see such fissures and cracks as simply different opportunities for mental travel and travail, beckoning the poet, translator, and reader alike. Thus, on the terrain of nomadic translation, accuracy in the traditional philological sense is neither discarded nor devalued, but is simply refused monopoly or exclusivity in the art of ferrying words and concepts from one linguistic and cultural shore to another. This more heterogeneous terrain does is to reinscribe the activity of translation as, I quote, a core process of writing and thinking. So a core process of writing and thinking, with constant, often simultaneous movement of drift, tending towards and directional change becoming as important as the finished product itself. So differently, in contrast with conventional philological approach and its stress on exactitude, what nomadic translation refuses to alliterate is the act that translating involves as rhizomatic a process as the act of writing and the process of aesthetic creation themselves. All in all, The ever-shifting terrain of nomadic translation that Joris has begun to delineate seems a far more congenial territory on which to locate Mexico City Blues, together with the poetic blues sequences that served as its forebears, as well as other highly personal, playful adaptations that Kerouac makes in his works of Buddhist classics like the Scripture of the Golden Eternity, or in some of the Dharma, his Buddhist journals. Owing to its interest in types of translation other than those from foreign language A into home language B, the concept of nomadic translation is inclusive enough to make room for the intralingual as well as intermediate translation that corresponded to Kerouac's practice of adapting already extant versions in English of Buddhist classics. Even more importantly, in his incipient theorization of nomadic translation, Joris also opens the door to the concept of post-semiotic translation, which, in his unpublished talk, he briefly discusses in connection with the experimental work of Canadian poet B.P. Nicol. Though it is not yet sure in which direction Joris will go to develop this concept further, post-semiotic translation is an appealing notion for the Kerouac scholar and reader, and this for several reasons. To begin with, Mexico City Blues very much partakes of the constant roll-on, rhizomatic movement of image and thought that is the linchpin of Joris's nomadic poetics. Indeed, heavily relying as it does on variation as its foremost compositional principle, Mexico City Blues is a nomadic composition, ceaselessly drifting between different versions of the same concepts, Buddhist emptiness and the aesthetic quest to become a jasmine in words. These endless poetic mutations on various facets of the same themes do indeed unfold a rhizomatic structure in which one corner is as important as another corner, once more the rhizome having no beginning or end, and being always in the middle, between things, interbeing, intermezzo. Likewise, as open-ended cartographies connecting the past with the present, physical geographies with mental ones, the individual and the mythical, the 242 choruses of Mexico City Blues are so many open-ended poetic riffs which invite poet and reader to incessant roaming between different spaces, states of mind, cultures, and sometimes languages. The constant breaking and re-breaking of a number of temporary equilibriums and impurity is very much what makes Mexico City Blues not only a beat poem, but also a rhizomatic and nomadic one. In Joris's parlance, Mexico City Blues very much operates on the page as, I quote, a war machine, always on the move, always changing, morphing, moving through languages, cultures, terrains, times without stopping, end quote. Furthermore, for Joris, post-semiotic translation considerably relies on procedures allowing for endless variability and variation within a set of formal constraints, which would certainly be one way to approach Mexico City Blues and its multiple variations on the untranslatable concept of the Buddhist void. But though Joris himself does not open this door in his unpublished essay, the concept of nomadic translation also seems to hold the potential and promise of opening other pathways, like, for instance, those precisely encouraging an exploration of what translating the untranslatable entails, or those leading to what might, for want of a better phrase, perhaps be called experiential translation. Extending Joris's foray into nomadic translation along these two roads is of utter relevance to Kerouac, most especially to the outfanning style. Most especially to the outfanning style of composition found in Mexico City Blues and his other works rooted in Buddhist epistemology. Indeed, as a man who remembered that by definition the void transcends language, the great Buddhist masters themselves tell us so, and as a man who also proved deeply aware of the fact that Dharma laws say all things is made of the same thing which is a nothing, or nothings are the same as some things are no nothings, equally blank. What fundamentally mattered to Kerouac was to approximate on the page the feel of an insubstantial subject and insubstantial objects mutually determining each other. The sensation of momentary experience in the non-dualist space of emptiness, and last but not least, the feel of the shortcoming of words to express the latter. These are clearly reaches beyond what pure philological translation can achieve, a fact too often overlooked by those peremptorily dismissing Kerouac's Buddhism and Beat Buddhism in general on the grounds of impurity and insuperable cultural barriers. Even if Kerouac had been able to access Buddhist teachings in their mother tongue, this would probably not have sufficed to allow him to ferry the experiential texture of the concepts of the void and non-duality from ancient Asian texts to the minds of contemporary American readers. This is to say, readers conditioned by a heavily dualist and theistic tradition. From one kind of English to another, this is a kind of impure because nomadic intralingual translation that the dynamic mosaic of Mexico City Blues performs in its attempt to familiarize writer and reader with a foreign concept of Buddhist emptiness and to immerse them in this foreign experience. Shifting between locations and religious systems, oscillating between sorrow and ecstasy.
Oh. Yeah, disconnected. Yes.
So, where was I? All right. So, shifting between locations and religious systems, oscillating between sorrow and ecstasy, moving from the profane to the sacred, dancing to the cadences of jazz or Buddhist sutras, traveling from standard Joycean English and sound poetry, journeying from the private to the mythical. The poetic voice at the heart of Mexico City Blues passes so many boundaries that it blurs them all in the process of questing form and translating the untranslatable. In short, when it comes to an appreciation of Mexico City Blues and Kerouac's rhizomatic adaptations of concepts and texts derived from pre-existing translations of Buddhist sutras in English, the kind of nomadic translation which Joris has begun to theorize is perhaps one of the only elements missing from the otherwise masterful cartography put together by James T. Jones in A Map of Mexico City Blues, a book published in 1992. More generally, nomadic translation and further extensions of the concept will certainly prove a vital gateway to reassessing Kerouac's religious syncretism and eclecticism, together with the work of conceptual and poetic translation that also underpin these in his other works rooted in the non-theistic, non-dualist spaces of Buddhist epistemology. And of course what holds true for Mexico City Blues holds true for the Scripture of the Golden Eternity, some of the very imaginative sections of some of the Dharma. So in fact I think the whole of Kerouac's experimental Buddhist work could be read through the lens that Joris proposes. Last but not least, future forays into the fluid territories of Joris's nomadic poetics and nomadic translation will, I believe, also provide some of the crucial missing links in our as yet incomplete understanding of Beat Buddhism as a whole. So I think that also, from a sociological point of view, how to interpret the role that the Beats played in the westernization of Buddhism also actually has to gain from incorporating Joris's point of view. Thank you very much for your attention.